Good afternoon. Nice to meet you all. I've brought gifts for each of you. They might be the wrong ones. I forgot what we were talking about, and so I wasn't sure if we were talking about homelessness or energy. So we brought 25 of Apocalypse Never and 25 of San Fransicko. Good to see you, Ken. The word civilization comes from an idea around cities. Cities being at the heart of it. To have that civilization, of course, requires taking your farming population from 90% to today's 1.5% of your population. What we call economic growth and development is just the process of moving away from people needing to produce their own food and energy, to being able to live in cities, to being able to be TikTok stars. That is the descent of man. So when we talk about cities, we have to talk about the whole thing. And the whole thing is in very serious trouble. My colleague Leighton Woodhouse and I just got a 14-year-old girl off the street who was being sex trafficked by the MS-13 gang. How in the hell did we let a Salvadoran drug gang take over large parts of our greatest city? This is insane. There are not enough police officers in San Francisco, 540 of them, but that's no excuse for allowing. She was 13. She was an orphan. She blamed herself for her parents' death. Wrongly blamed herself for her parents' death, but she's a 13-year-old girl. How does a society allow that to happen? A 16-year-old girl died in San Francisco a year ago, and we now know that she was being sexually assaulted while she was dying of smoking fentanyl. Why is that happening? This is not a kind of abstract debate about do you support Keynesian economics or neoclassical economics. I couldn't find anybody that supports allowing 13 and 14 and 16-year-old girls to be sex trafficked. I can't find anybody. And I'm widely hated by a large segment of the San Francisco voting public. I can't find anybody who objected to us getting this girl off the streets. We reached the assistant police chief, and he said, "This is horrible. What can I say? I've got a 15-year-old daughter at home. So if we can't protect our children," we went and pulled the budgets on San Francisco, and I just Googled, compared similarly sized cities. We found Fort Worth, and it has 150,000 more people, and it has 1/3 the budget of San Francisco. San Francisco is like one of the richest cities, maybe the richest city in the world, and these things are going on there. So these things are going on. It's not happening in Congo. In Apocalypse Never, I described Congo. There is no civilization in Congo. There's no functioning civilization as defined by Max Weber as the monopolization of violence by the state. That doesn't exist in Congo. But now there's parts of San Francisco that have been de-civilized, actively de-civilized, taken back from a state of civilization. You might remember in Vertigo these incredible scenes when it opens of the city, or if you watch All About Eve, which is a truly underrated classic from 1950. He says to Eve, the journalist, he says, "Have you been to San Francisco? A bit of civilization in the desert." So long ago now, we forget about it. So what happened? There's at least 3 fundamental pillars of our civilization: cheap energy, law and order, and meritocracy. All 3 of them are being eroded, actively undermined right now. We don't have enough police officers in San Francisco or Los Angeles. You're not getting people the psychiatric care that they need. Driving through Sacramento, it's the same here, gotten much worse. You have to have law and order to be able to protect people and keep 13-year-old girls from being trafficked. We don't have that. We don't have cheap energy. California's electricity prices increased 7 times more than they did in the rest of the United States over the last 10 years. We're experiencing a tripling of gas and energy prices in Southern California right now, even though gas prices globally in the global market are low. We have the most expensive electricity outside of Hawaii and the most expensive gasoline. We're completely eroding what we call meritocracy. There's a war on selecting for the best in your field. We're not cultivating the best of our kids. We got rid of vocational education. This is insane. And we have a 12% math proficiency rate for black kids in Los Angeles schools, 12%. So we are eroding away these three pillars. We can talk about families. Family's important to that. But not everybody has a family. That 14-year-old girl deserves to be protected even though she doesn't have a family. So what's going on here? Why is it that in the most civilized part of our societies, the most civilized, San Francisco, the elite, the most bourgeois, the most affluent, why do we have large parts of the city controlled by MS-13 drug gangs, drug and sex trafficking gangs? Why are we allowing 500 to 600 of people to just be murdered by salesmen for a foreign drug cartel that is so brazen that now the drug gangs are actually imitating cartel-style killings? In Goshen, which is 30 minutes down the road from Fresno, they killed a family of 6 people, gangland style, execution style. We now have video of the 16-year-old mother escaping with her baby and then being hunted down by savages and shot in the head, and her baby shot in the head. That's happening now in our state. That does not happen in civilized societies. That happens in the Congo. That happens in parts of Brazil where there is no governance. That's happening now in Goshen. There is not a functioning state in many ways. So what is going on with this? This is not a result of scarcity, this is a result of abundance. This is a story that you know, in the sense it's a story of decadence, it's a story, the idea that you don't need law enforcement, that law enforcement is bad, that there's this thing called victimless crimes. Who knew there were victimless crimes? Yeah, why in the world would you have laws if there's no victims? This is a radical libertarianism. It's not just progressivism. My sister lives in Boston, and they don't allow this in Boston. They don't. It's bad. They had an open-air drug scene, and they referred to it honestly in Boston as an open-air drug scene. And it's the Boston Globe, is owned by the New York Times. It's just as woke as the San Francisco Chronicle in most ways, but they're not so dishonest as we are about what's going on the streets. They know it's an addiction crisis. They know it's a mental health crisis. They intervene. We're just more libertarian. And it's the left libertarian, which you can call anarchism, you can call it the radical left, you can call it wokeism. At the heart of it is victimhood politics, victimhood movements. This is the idea that you can divide the world into victims and oppressors. Y'all are oppressors. Don't have any doubt about it. It's okay, so am I. And it's a racist ideology. It says that all white people are oppressive and bad, and all people of color are good and victims. And so it's a sacred victim cult. It's a replacement religion for Judeo-Christianity. The Japanese are just as decadent as we are, but they have an ancestor mythology. So they don't create a substitute religion that so exactly mirrors Judeo-Christianity in its structure, but has been infused with wokeism. So with climate change, you get a new vision of the apocalypse. With race, you get a new reason to feel guilty. And with trans, you get a kind of soul. These girls that are experiencing severe anxiety disorders and think that they can be physically transformed into boys. It's not something I've been looking into or writing about. It's an issue I'm very cautious about. I'm a huge supporter of same-sex marriages. I've fought for same-sex relationships. But we now know from Britain that sudden onset gender dysphoria is an ideologically constructed phenomenon, that the girls that would have had anorexia, the women in my life, many of whom suffered anorexia as girls, which is an anxiety disorder, are now experiencing sudden gender dysphoria. So there's something going on in the society that's eroding these fundamental foundations. And so the solution, on the one hand, is a return to some common sense. You have to have cheap energy and food to have a functioning civilization. You must have law and order to prevent 13 and 14-year-olds from being sex trafficked in San Francisco and to prevent gangland-style killings like the ones in Goshen. You must have a meritocracy if you hope your bridges aren't going to collapse. You must believe in math. You must think math is a thing, an objective reality separate from histories and hierarchies of oppression. But that's not enough, and we now have 75 years of very good psychological research into totalitarianism, totalitarian ideologies, by which I mean principally fascism, communism, wokeism, or victimhood ideologies. These are ideologies that are totalitarian in the sense they're trying to completely transform society in every sphere of society and trying to order it and change human nature in ways that we know cannot be changed. And we know that you can't just morally condemn these things. It's not enough to just say it's wrong for girls to be sex trafficked. Everybody agrees. You have to describe the derangement that a small minority, but very clever at using language and at manipulating emotions, is using. You have to describe what they're doing as a sociologist and as a psychologist and as a theologian, so to speak, or someone that understands what's going on. Many of the people that are dying of drug overdoses on the streets or attempting to change their sex or lost are creative, spiritual, non-STEM type folks who are more open-minded, too open-minded, and have lost themselves, they've lost their orientation to the world. My friend Jordan Peterson, a psychologist from Canada, has done the best analyses of these at the personality, what's going on at the personality level. But the picture we're getting now of just what the hell happened over the last 3 to 6 years, it's getting clearer. It's a kind of rising secularization, a spiritual hunger from the population, anxiety, which many people think all anxiety is all related to death anyway, social anxiety, fear of losing your community, fear of losing a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, all of that then being absolutely weaponized and intensified by social media. And we can now see the studies have just come out, and Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist's research, has all been absolutely vindicated on this issue. We're seeing rising levels of intense sadness, loneliness, and suicidality among adolescent girls. Obviously, a major personal concern for me as a father of a 17-year-old. She's made it out okay, but it's brutal to watch. It's something like I think it's 40% now of girls report significant levels of sadness. Similar upward trajectories of those negative emotions among boys, but much worse with girls. We need to respond to this crisis at all levels. So it's not enough to just say we need more police. It's not enough to say we can't have girls being trafficked. We have to affirm life. We have to affirm the human animal and our specialness and and have a sense of gratitude for being alive and being able to live in a state that's as magnificent as this. My first time in this building and room. Delightful. We have to affirm health and a kind of stoicism, maybe the most misinterpreted philosophical tradition, a sense in which there's some things that you don't control, some things you do control, have courage to do the things you need to do, and let go of the rest. We have to restore physical education to our schools because it's obviously not working. We have to start from this, and I hate to say the word pro-life because it'll be misunderstood, but an affirmation of life, an affirmation of our goodness of the human animal, whether you think we were created by gods or descended from other species. It's a beautiful thing to be alive and to be healthy, and that should be understood and taught. And building up from that, then comes an appreciation of civilization. That you don't get to have rights as a normal person, as a woman, as a minority, as someone that has non-typical sexual preferences. You don't get your rights in a society that doesn't operate under rules of law with abundant, cheap energy. Civilization is the foundation for all of this, and it's being eroded, and nobody has to be convinced of that in California right now. Is this a politically impossible? Is this just a radical thing? It's not. We've poll after poll, 75% of people in San Francisco, 75% of San Francisco voters want addicts who are dying all around them to be mandated rehab, recovery, not addiction maintenance. Most people don't want people to just be kept alive in tents and have food brought to them and socks and have the toilets cleaned up after them. Most people don't think that's right. That's the work of a very small and powerful and manipulative minority. Most people want a proper approach, the kinds that we have in civilized countries to deal with the homeless problem. Most people want police officers, and you saw Democrats get right on it. So the agenda is popular. It needs to be connected to a deeper understanding of civilization. I wanted to say something about the family. I had 3 chapters in San Fransicko about the family. Obviously, families are really important, and the outcomes if you have an intact family are much better than if you don't have an intact family. The political right has been very clear about that, and it's made that point very loudly over the last 30 years, and it's had absolutely no impact, as far as I can tell, on public policy or on family stability. It's not to say that you shouldn't moralize or we shouldn't say that we think that's good, but that's not an agenda exactly. Civilization is, and the inspiration for San Fransicko in part was visiting the Netherlands and realizing that this is a very liberal country right there in the northwest of Western Europe. Very liberal, very rich, very similar to California, maybe the Bay Area in particular, but there are no homeless people. There are no encampments. They do not allow people to use drugs in public. They do not allow open-air drug scenes, open-air drug dealings. Yes, there is some amount of sex work, but it's heavily regulated, and they struggle with it. And they chase drug dealers all around. They can't eliminate drugs, but they certainly try to keep them down and repressed. One thing we discovered in the research for San Fransicko was that, speaking of victimless crimes, when you stop enforcing drug laws, drugs become more available. It's shocking to all of you, right? When they become more available, they become cheaper. And so I interviewed one mom whose son is on the street. We've organized mothers of kids whose sons are homeless addicts. These are women that are full of shame. And every time they speak out, they're ashamed for speaking out. And yet they are the most powerful spokespeople for our movement. And they said, when my son was in San Diego, he had to run around town all day long just to find the heroin to get his fix. He comes to San Francisco, and what we call encampments, it's important to understand, are what Europeans call open drug scenes. That's where addicts who are so in late-stage addiction, they end up living near the dealers. They don't want to walk the 2 blocks to the shelter bed. They want to stay right there next to the dealer. So people are just disintegrating in public space. So you can't solve some of these problems. We can't solve family breakup. We can't solve people's desire to become addicts. But you can protect your cities. The sweet spot for those of us that consider ourselves liberals, libertarians, and conservatives is that we're not going to chase around people if you're using drugs in the privacy of your own home. But if your addiction has led you to stop working, lie, steal, and cheat from family and friends, and lose your housing, and become an addict, and live on the street, and break the laws against public camping, against public drug use, public defecation, then you must be arrested, and you must be mandated some kind of evaluation or care. And if in your state of addiction, you say you would rather kick in jail rather than go to rehab, that's available to you. But what's not available to you is to disintegrate and die on the streets. It's too expensive. It's too immoral. Thank you. It's the highest cost is not the financial burden. The financial burden is absurd. 50% of all fires in Los Angeles and California in the cities are responding to homeless people, usually overdosing. But the highest cost is the moral cost. And this should matter to the folks that love to moralize about other states. We are in no position to make any moral judgment of any state in America or any civilization across time. If you are discovering naked, psychotic black girls like I did in a blanket alone with predatory men not 10 feet away, and you call 911 and no cops come, nor call you back, you are in no position to talk about the legacy of slavery and racism at all. So it is a moral crusade. It's not the same as a moralizing crusade. We have obligations as citizens of society, and one of those obligations is to follow the law. Victim ideology says that you can divide the world into victims and oppressors, and to victims everything should be given and nothing required, not even obeying the law. That is ridiculous. And you could not find more than 10% of the voting public in California that agrees with that. We have an identity problem, and I don't have a solution to it, but I do want to mention it, which is that you have 24% support for Republicans in California. You have a hard barrier in terms of what can be achieved with that identity. I think we have a problem with the conservative identity as well. And unfortunately, words matter. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what the right words are. I don't have a solution for this. All I can do is do what the punk rock movement did, which is to say, when things get too crazy and complicated, like rock did in the 70s, got too orchestral, and the punk movement said you can have a singer, a guitarist, and a drummer, and that's it. You can have 3 guys on stage, if that, and that's where you need to start. The punk rock move goes, what is the basics? And I think it's those 3 things. You need civilization if you're going to affirm life. You need cheap energy, law and order, and meritocracy. Start there, and then everything needs to flow from that. I love talking about my family. I love my family. My family is the most important thing for me. There's kids out there that don't have families, and we need to have a civilization that protects their rights and their freedoms and their humanity, and that's why I don't think it's the right ground for a powerful center-right politics to be built in California. I'm really eager to have a conversation with all of you, and I hope that you consider staying for a few minutes so we can have a chat. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here. Thank you guys very much.
Questions? Yep.
Thank you. I miss your novels, but I think what you're doing is better for your soul. It seems that, as you're implying, the majority of California voters probably agree with the way these problems are articulated, but they seem to have a marvelous propensity to disassociate how they vote with all these problems that we've been talking about today. And it seems to me that that's the core of the problem, that you have to get people to make that connection. And I haven't heard a lot of discussion about that, and I don't know if you have any ideas. It probably is a difficult thing to solve.
This is the hardest problem. So I don't have solutions. All I can have is some directions, and that's the intention of my remarks, was to attempt to lay a new foundation, which is a foundation of civilization, not the family. And I say this as somebody whose family is the most important thing in my life. But the ground is civilization for us in California. I think there is also this issue of compassion. Particularly, Republicans in California are not viewed as compassionate. Fairly or unfairly, that is the reality. There's some big things that I think will help to address this, and I think then there's some smaller things. One of the big things has to do with criminal justice. not everybody needs to go to prison. In fact, one could argue that most people that are arrested for most things do not need to go to prison. But we've just been letting people out of prison. And the consequences are the high rates of crime that we're seeing. We're in a psychiatric emergency. We're at every level of the society. I mean, it's not just the social media driving people crazy. I mean, it's really, you see it in the politics, you see it on the streets. There has to be a treatment-first approach to homelessness, that we're going to get people the psychiatric care that they need. That comes before any conversation about them getting their own apartment unit, which is the official policy called Housing First in California. The policy that was first implemented by Governor Gavin Newsom when he was mayor of San Francisco. We cannot offer an apartment unit in San Francisco to everybody in the United States that wants one. And people know that. But that we do have, I think that where people are also at is that if you're going to arrest somebody for living on the street in the throes of their addiction or untreated mental illness, or both, it's usually both, then they need to be able to get the proper psychiatric care that they need. So there are two universal entitlements that should make all Republicans and conservatives very uncomfortable, but nonetheless is probably the work that needs to occur for the center-right to have sway and majority status in California. The first entitlement is that you have a right to shelter, and you have an obligation to take it or get off the streets. You do not have a right to your own apartment units. Apartment units are earned. It's shelter first, housing earned for those people that need it. But even the people that are in real trouble, like my aunt who had schizophrenia, she lived in a group home. She didn't need her own apartment unit. She needed a group home. She needed her own room, maybe her own bath. That's real nice if she can have her own bath in a house with 6 to 12 other people. That's a shelter-first policy, but they have to get the psychiatric care. And the feds will help pay for it. I mean, that's what Medicaid is for. So we're not doing it because the ACLU is in the grip of a radical anti-psychiatry mentality that is just one flew over the cuckoo's nest. That's all it is. It's not more complicated than that. They're not very thoughtful about it. They don't have anything interesting to say about it. They're totally in the minority. The governor just rolled over them with care courts. But it has to be, I think, stated as a value proposition from whatever center-right political movement or party is here. So you have a right to shelter, you have a right to psychiatry, you don't have a right to an apartment. And those two things might be hard for some folks in this room or some folks that identify as Republican or conservative or libertarian to accept. But I think that those are baseline parts of the function. And if you do them right, then you're not going to need to spend the $130 grand a year on housing people in prisons. If you do it right with assertive case management, with contingency management, where you pass a drug test, then you might get your own room in a group home rather than having to be in congregate shelter. It has to be something that's earned. So as far as I've worked out, that basic, we're pro-civilization, we're pro-abundant energy, food, water, housing. We're for law and order, but we're going to meet those law and order demands by getting people into shelter and in the psychiatry they need, and meritocracy.
Questions?
I want to say one more thing about this. It's headed this way in many ways. It's the Rick Caruso lost the mayoral race in Los Angeles. But what won was the idea that you have to get people off the streets. And so Karen Bass, former member of Congress, she's now the mayor of Los Angeles, has started a program called Inside Safe. This is also part of the work that we were drawing a light to over the last couple of years, including San Francisco but elsewhere. We know now that if you are an unsheltered homeless person, meaning if you're living on the street, either in a tent or not in a tent, if you're living on the street and not in a shelter, you are 3 times more likely to die than a homeless person that's inside. And we now have a long-term cohort study that was done out of Harvard over 10 years that proved this 3-fold difference in mortality, which is gigantic if you are familiar with health studies in general, if you get 20, 30% of something, but threefold is massive. And then we have the same comparison between New York and Los Angeles. Los Angeles only shelters 1/3 of its homeless. New York shelters over 95%. 3 times higher mortality in Los Angeles than New York. And so the new progressive mayor of Los Angeles is trying to get people inside. It's called Inside Safe. That's a step in the right direction. You know, the cause of death, by the way, it's just the things you might imagine: drug overdose, homicide, and being run over by a car. And you can still drive overdose or be killed in a shelter, although it's a lot less likely, but it's basically impossible to be run over by a car. So you got to get people inside, but then once they're inside, they have got to deal with the cause of the dysfunction, which is their untreated mental illness and or their addiction, and you just have to use carrots and sticks to get them to do that. Rewards and consequences. It's very simple at a social worker level, but because wokeism and victimhood ideology is so powerful, from the governor down to the social worker, we're not doing that with people. One of the most interesting things I discovered in San Fransicko was that, you know, the rich, including the Bidens, when their kids become addicts, they go to world-class rehab facilities, and guess what? They're tough as hell on those guys. It's tough love at Malibu rehab centers. Okay, the rich, for their kids, they want tough love because they want their kids to get over their addictions. The poor people are stuck on Skid Row, and they're left to just OD and die sad, pathetic deaths on the streets. And so that inequality is also something. The progressives are not compassionate. It's not compassionate to do what they're doing. That's your way into reestablishing some sort of center-right politics in California, I think.
Questions? Oh, there you are.
Hi, can you speak to the anti-loitering law that went into effect January 1st this year, and what it's doing to human trafficking?
Senator Scott Wiener, the state senator from San Francisco, he said that it was bad that police were talking to and occasionally arresting the women and the trans women who were loitering with the intent of soliciting prostitution. He said that was a social injustice, and he persuaded his colleagues and the governor to sign it into law. As soon as they signed it into law, the groups in California that monitor and intervene to stop sex trafficking, including of minors, saw an immediate increase in street prostitution. Our sources estimate that street walking has increased 2 to 3 folds in both San Francisco and Los Angeles since that law was passed. And it's victimless crimes whose victims are 13-year-old girls and psychotic little black girls who are naked on the streets. So it's absolutely pathetic. It's not enough to condemn it. We also have to understand it. It comes right out of this idea that the police are bad. The criminal justice system is bad. Civilization is bad. That's where it comes from. It's that dumb. I wish I could say that I got to the bottom of it and I discovered a great sophistication in the ideology. Because there's a lot of complicated writing, you know, you read Foucault and Derrida, it's not the simplest stuff, but at bottom of it is a really bad, dumb idea, which is that you can actually rank victims. You might have heard of a movement called the BIPOC movement. The BIPOC movement was created because the people that created it felt like black and indigenous people were not high enough on the victimhood totem pole and needed to be elevated above Latinos and particularly Asians, who are so troublesome for maintaining that absurd racist hierarchy. So the idea was, for Senator Wiener, that the police, who are the bad guys, were the problem. That it's the police that are the problem. Not MS-13, not the Johns. So there is sex work in other countries around the world, and it is the oldest profession, and it is not an easy problem to solve, but there does seem to be more progress made in criminalizing the Johns rather than criminalizing the women. That seems to be a way that they've discovered in some countries to reduce the number of women that are in it, that are coerced into it. And without buying into all of some of the rhetoric around it, around sort of some women want it or whatever, if you're going to have these vices in society that we have never been able to fully eliminate and would probably require a kind of authoritarian or totalitarian dictatorship that none of us would want, you have to have laws that don't, you have to stop treating the police as though the police are the problem. You know, in the Netherlands, one of my main sources there, he said, you know, what happened in the Netherlands is the police became more like social workers, and the social workers became more like police. That's a much richer, more complex, tough love strategy than this really dumb, radical, woke view that the police are bad. That any interaction between the police and the public or the police and victims is bad. In fact, a lot of interaction between the police and women or potential victims and also the people that are most likely to commit homicide is good. It prevents crime. So we have to confront these, we have to describe what our opponents, how they're thinking and what is the thinking behind these atrocities and not just condemn it. We have to explain what's going on because what that does, it's a little bit like cognitive therapy for the people. It helps to sort of reveal just how dumb woke victimhood ideology is. When you really, my ex is very, very progressive. We were all in Berkeley, and she, when we started seeing that these girls were regretting having puberty blockers and these so-called gender reassignment surgeries, she was one of the first people in my life that said, I think this has gone too far. And I think there's a lot of that to build on in the state. Thank you, Stephen.